Imagine a German general, commanding over 100,000 soldiers deep inside enemy territory, deliberately choosing to surrender, not to the army closing in from the east, but to the very enemy he had been fighting for years in the west. What would drive a man to make that decision? And what would the legendary, feared, and brilliantly ruthless General George S. Patton say when that German commander walked into his headquarters and handed over an entire army on a silver platter? This is not fiction. This happened. In the final days of World War II, in the forests and mountains of Czechoslovakia and Austria, one of the most astonishing military surrenders in modern history unfolded. A surrender born not from defeat on the battlefield, but from cold calculation, desperate fear, and a last act of strategic genius by a commander who understood that the real war had just changed its face. The story begins not in the chaos of April 1945, but years earlier, in the mind of a man who had watched empires collapse before. If this kind of story grips you, real history, real decisions, real consequences, then subscribe to this channel right now, hit the like button, and share this video with someone who loves history as much as you do. Drop a comment below telling us what part of this story you had never heard before. Your engagement keeps these stories alive, and this one deserves to be heard. Field Marshal Ferdinand Schorner was not the kind of man who inspired affection. Born in Munich on June 12, 1892, he was hard, ideologically committed, and brutally demanding of his troops. By 1945, he commanded Army Group Center, one of the last coherent German military formations still holding together as the Third Reich disintegrated around it. His force, positioned primarily in Bohemia and Moravia, numbered somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million soldiers, depending on the source and the day counted. These were not broken remnants. These were organized, armed, and desperate men. Schorner had been personally appointed by Adolf Hitler to hold this position at all costs, and he had received the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, the highest military decoration the Nazi state could bestow. He was, in every measurable sense, one of the most powerful and dangerous German commanders still in the field in May 1945. Yet even he could see that the arithmetic of the war was over. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. And from the east came the massive, unstoppable tide of the Soviet Red Army. The difference between surrendering to the Americans and surrendering to the Soviets in 1945 was not a matter of pride or protocol. It was, for many German soldiers and commanders, a matter of survival itself. The Eastern Front had been a war of absolute savagery, a conflict in which both sides had committed atrocities on a scale that left no room for gentlemanly treatment of prisoners. German soldiers who fell into Soviet hands faced years, sometimes decades, in brutal labor camps in Siberia or simply vanished. Officers faced war crimes tribunals and executions. The men under Schorner's command had fought on the Eastern Front for years. They had seen what happened when the Red Army overran German positions. Fear was not an abstraction for them. It was a living, breathing thing that moved through every rank. At the same time, the American forces under General George S. Patton's Third Army were advancing rapidly through Bavaria and into Czechoslovakia, closing the distance from the west. For men who understood the geography of their own fate, the calculation was brutally clear. Surrender east and face a nightmare. Surrender west and perhaps survive. Walther Wenck, Theodore Bussy, Felix Steiner. These were the names of commanders who, in the final weeks of the war, made similar calculations, trying to move their forces westward to surrender to Allied forces rather than Soviet ones. But the most dramatic of all such maneuvers belonged to General Walther Wenck's 12th Army, which had been ordered by Hitler to relieve Berlin. Wenck, recognizing that Berlin was already lost, instead pivoted his entire army westward toward the Elbe River, fighting through Soviet lines not to save the Reich, but to create a corridor through which hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and civilians could escape to American lines. Between April 28 and May 7, 1945, Wenck's forces held open that corridor near Tangermund on the Elbe, allowing an estimated 100,000 soldiers and a roughly equal number of civilians to cross over and surrender to American forces. Wenck did not ask permission. He did not receive orders to do this. He simply decided, with the clarity of a man who had given up on the Reich and chosen to save his people, that this was what he would do. And then he went and did it. It was into this extraordinary context, armies in motion, fronts dissolving, the map of Europe being redrawn in real time, that General George S. Patton operated in the final days of the war. Patton's Third Army had covered more ground, liberated more territory, and moved with more devastating speed than virtually any other Allied formation in the European theater. By early May 1945, Patton was pushing into Czechoslovakia, and he was doing something that his superiors in the Allied command were increasingly nervous about. He was moving toward Prague, and he was receiving surrenders from German units who specifically sought out American lines to avoid the Soviets. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, under enormous political pressure and bound by agreements made at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, ordered Patton to stop his advance at the Pilsen Line and not enter Prague. Patton was furious. He believed, and history would later suggest he was correct, that allowing Soviet forces to take Prague would cement communist domination of Czechoslovakia for generations. But orders were orders, even for Patton. He stopped. He waited. And the Germans kept coming to him. Now, halfway through this remarkable story, pause for a moment and consider what you are hearing. Real commanders, real armies, real decisions made under conditions of unimaginable pressure. If this kind of deep historical storytelling moves you, subscribe to this channel right now and make sure you never miss another story like this one. Hit the like button, share this video with a friend who deserves to know this history, and leave a comment below. What detail has surprised you most so far? Your comments don't just motivate us, they tell us which stories matter most to you. The figure of General Hermann Forch enters the narrative at this precise moment. Forch was Chief of Staff of Army Group G, the German formation operating in southern Germany and Austria. On May 5, 1945, in a small Austrian town called Haar, near Munich, Forch formally surrendered Army Group G, comprising approximately 400,000 soldiers, to General Jacob L. Devers of the American 6th Army Group. But the surrender that most captured the imagination of history came slightly differently in Czechoslovakia, where multiple German commanders sought out American lines with their full formations intact. What made these surrenders so striking was their deliberateness. These were not commanders whose armies had been shattered in battle. They were commanders who had calculated, navigated, and marched their men westward on purpose, crossing through territory, negotiating local ceasefires, and presenting themselves to American officers with their armies still organized and armed because they trusted correctly that Patton's Americans would treat them as soldiers rather than as enemies to be consumed by vengeance. When Patton encountered these surrendering German commanders, the exchanges were noted by multiple officers and aides present at those meetings. Patton, who was a complicated and sometimes infuriating figure even to his own side, had a deeply professional respect for competent enemy soldiers. He had studied the campaigns of Rommel. He had followed German operational thinking throughout the war with the attention of a scholar. And he was pragmatic in ways that made his superiors uncomfortable. According to accounts from officers present at several of these surrender receptions in May 1945, Patton was direct, composed, and even respectful toward German commanders who came to him with their forces intact. He reportedly told at least one senior German officer that he had made the right decision, that any professional soldier could see the difference between a lost war and a lost cause, and that preserving his men's lives when the outcome was already decided was not cowardice, but command. Patton also made no secret, in these private meetings, of his own views on the Soviet Union, views that would soon get him removed from command entirely. Patton believed that the Soviet Union was not an ally, but a future adversary, and he was willing to say so in rooms where such statements were explosive. In a letter to his wife Beatrice written in May 1945, and in comments recorded by his aide Colonel Charles Codman, Patton expressed the view that the Western Allies had stopped too soon, that the Soviets would absorb Eastern Europe, and that the generation then alive would live to see another war. He was not entirely wrong. Czechoslovakia fell under Soviet-backed communist rule in February 1948 in the coup known as Victorious February. The men Patton had received in those surrender meetings, German officers, who had walked their armies westward to escape the East, had made a choice that saved their lives, but did not save their countries from the geopolitical consequences of Yalta. Schorner himself, the commander of Army Group Center, attempted to flee by aircraft and disguise himself as a civilian, was captured by the Americans, handed over to the Soviets, tried, and sentenced to 25 years in a Soviet labor camp. He served 10. The contrast between the fate of commanders who reached Patton and those who did not could not have been more stark or more permanent. This story of armies marching toward mercy, of generals calculating survival against ideology, of Patton standing at the edge of history, making hard decisions in rooms that smelled of diesel and defeat, is one of the most human stories the Second World War produced. It is a story about what men do when the structures that gave their lives meaning have collapsed completely, and all that remains is the instinct to survive and the choice of who to trust. The German commanders who surrendered to Patton were not heroes. Many of them had served a regime of monstrous cruelty and bore responsibility for what that regime had done. But in those final days, they made a calculation that was entirely rational, and Patton, ever the professional, ever the realist, received them with the cold respect of one soldier recognizing another's final, desperate competence. History does not always offer clean moral conclusions, but it always offers truth if you are willing to look. If this story moved you, educated you, or made you see this moment in history differently, then please subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to understand how history really works, not in textbooks, but in the decisions of frightened and powerful men at the end of everything they knew. And leave a comment. What part of this story will you carry with you?